Well, good evening. Welcome to this live stream edition on the 25th of August. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Welcome to this live event, and thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. I have Joe Wilkes ready to come on stream. Just before we introduce him, let me just make a couple of normal points, as I always do. Firstly, just to be sure, this is not financial advice that we're offering tonight. Generic chat, opinion, yes, but not financial advice. If you need financial advice, go talk to a financial advisor. Secondly, please play nice in the chat room. No racial slurs. Plexus is doing a great job on the old moderating. Thanks, Plexus. Really appreciate that. Hopefully it'll be a little quieter than the China debate a couple of weeks ago. This is as at 25th of August, of course, today, and later, if you're watching this 2 years down the track, we'll know whether we're right or whether we're wrong. If you want to get my attention, use @WalkTheWorld, which is my handle, to get my attention. There's always lots of chat going on the stream, and I won't necessarily be able to look at it all, but if you use @WalkTheWorld, there's a good chance I will. And there's super chat enabled to do two things. Firstly, you can make sure your question goes to the top of the queue, and that means that we'll get to answer it. And secondly, if you want to make a donation to help DFA with everything we're doing, that would be greatly appreciated. We do this out of concern for what's going on and not to make a profit. So, we try to cover our costs as best we can. So there you go. And now, without further ado, let me push a few buttons and see whether we can get Joe to come in. Hello, Joe. Are you there?
I'm here, Martin. Good to see you again.
Hey, it's all working.
That's very good to hear. And thanks for mentioning our hairdos. Well, you and I are looking very flat. We've... I think we've been Donald Trumped by Edwin from last night. He looked very Buffontish. But unfortunately, I can't do that anymore. So, yeah, good to see you, mate. How are you?
Yeah, very good. And the line from New Zealand is
everybody watching this live for the
good.
first time. I've not done a live one before, so excuse me.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's good to have you on. And, we had a long period of time when you were doing other things and couldn't participate in this, and we kept saying we need to cover New Zealand, and it's very tough to cover New Zealand if you're not over there because there's not a lot of data around, right? So
yeah, well, it's pretty opaque, and you have to go and dig into all sorts of areas to try and find it. And I was a little bit conflicted for a while because I was the general manager of a national real estate brand for a year. So there were things that I could talk about, but there were also other things that were sensitive. So you and I came across each other back in November 2018. I'd seen a couple of your posts, and I thought, this guy's talking sense. I've got some experience. I've sort of spent my working career has been in property and advising businesses and working around various things from their structures to how they look at brand, how they look at their people, how they look at training. But at the same point, I've also got an economics degree, and I suppose, having seen everything that I saw in the UK, I thought, well, this guy's talking sense. I like what you're doing. I remember phoning you up about a week or so before Remembrance Sunday in 2018 and saying, well, I'm over in Australia this weekend. Can you... would you like to film something? And you kindly picked me up from the Royal Station and took me back to your place for, I think it was a fairly early morning filming. I remember being back in Sydney for lunch at 12. So we were literally in and out of the car, and yeah, the rest I say is history. But no, apologies, I've not been able to get involved for the last year or so. I can now, and it's always good to catch up and I suppose just sort of talk about a lot of things that don't get talked about because basically New Zealand media is shit.
Well, what's most interesting, Joe, from our first conversation was you've been through the ringer back in the UK around the global financial crisis and after, because you were involved in property there and you saw that whole thing come unglued, right? And I remember we were talking at the time of, wonder whether we're going to see something similar down here, and all the early leading indicators, the high debt and all the spruiking and everything else was somewhat similar. And now, of course, the process has rolled on, and we've got the lockdowns and the economic issues. So all those issues that were theoretically concerning us a couple of years ago are now practically concerning us. So it might be good just for people to get a little bit of a sense of, what were the two or three things that really hit you in the UK through that significant downturn, and what lessons do you think you learned and could be applied now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was running a real estate business with two partners in the UK, and we built up a reasonable sized private company. It had been going before I got involved, but I was involved from 2001 all the way through to 2017. And the things for us were that I suppose there's lots of warning signs along the way. I was involved in a booming market 2001 to all the way through to 2007-8. And then I saw the correction, and there's a lot of things that I suppose the thing for me is the whole credit side of things. When we saw the continual relaxation of credit standards, who was able to borrow money, at what terms they were able to borrow money, and the multiples at which they were able to borrow money at. And I got to New Zealand back in the end of 2017, and I thought, how we're actually just perpetuating. And on a grander scale, because I'd never seen 8 and 9 times household income being lent as mortgages. The most I'd ever seen in the UK was 5 or 6 times household income. And you have to think this is where you're in an economy where generally the cost of living are much lower in the UK. So, food prices are cheaper, electricity is cheaper, power bills are cheaper, mobile phones are cheaper, all of those things. And yet we were in New Zealand where, it just seemed like I've just walked back into the same crap that I've had to deal with, and it's a bit of a shock, really. I mean, I suppose the thing for me was, I saw the stresses that played out in the system during 9, 10, 11, 12. We started to recover, and I was working in a Hertfordshire market just outside London, nice area, commuter belt town, high income earners, but high income earners who'd also borrowed a hell of a lot of money. And for me, it was crap. We're repeating the same things, but we've done it on steroids, because the thing that I think has spared the UK. I mean, we've struggled because we've struggled to grow private sector credit growth since 2008, 2009. We've relied on government money printing or deficits and borrowing and Reserve Bank intervention, and that's sort of seen us through. But the government purse is, well, it's fucked, and the private sector credit momentum has never been able to really get going up again. But somehow in Australia and New Zealand, we were able, you've been able to keep this credit growth and momentum go all the way really to 2017, and I would say that the year after we met, it probably started to change the year after we met, but from then on, it's been okay, all hands to the pump. And you and I were warning over a year ago now about we can see negative cash rate at reserve banks. There's a lot of discussion about it now in New Zealand. They're preparing us for it, and all it is because if we don't keep growing that private debt every year at the same pace and faster than it was previously, our economy has a heart attack.
Well, the rate of change of credit, right, is always the thing to look at, because effectively the rate of change drives prices up or down, right? And so it's the delta that's important. And of course, we're in the situation now where the rate of credit growth is pretty much flatlining. Certainly in Australia, we'll check in a second what it's doing in New Zealand, because not many people in Australia will necessarily know what the New Zealand property market has been doing. So maybe that's something we should talk about in a second. I should just say, Joe, do watch your language just a little bit, or we might get we might get chopped. Okay.
It's a good old Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, I know that. It's just, and I know it's part of you, but just watch it a little bit. A couple of people on the chat were laughing about it, right, like Cookie Boy, but a couple of the others were a little bit. Just be a little bit careful. But anyway, look, the point.
Sorry, everybody.
So I reckon you have to put some in the kitty each time you use a swear word, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'll stick a tenner in.
Now, in terms of what's going on, let's just sort of try and get a little bit of a picture of New Zealand property, right? Because essentially, you had a lockdown, and then you basically had a strategy to sort of squeeze the virus out, and it looked like it was working. And then the economy started bouncing back, and basically prices started and sales momentum started to pick up again. I mean, so what's the current state of play?
Yeah, I mean July set record median prices across the country. So average median price across the country is at an all-time high. We've and I suppose you have to put it in relative terms. And I always take into account that New Zealand houses are generally bigger than UK houses, but they're generally more expensive to run because of inefficiencies in how they're built and energy costs. And we do have a lot of, I suppose, houses that were built back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that just don't really compute to anything that was even built in the Victorian time in the UK. So the running costs are quite high. On I suppose, a trade-weighted basis, our median price now is around 660,000 New Zealand dollars. Which for July, that compares to the UK, where you've got an average price in the UK. And we don't do medians in the UK, so it's difficult to compare apples and eggs, but that's the only thing that we've got, because they don't tend to report the average prices in New Zealand, to report the medians. So median price is $660,000. In the UK, you've got £235,000 equivalent average price, which at current exchange rates 2 to 1 is $470,000. So New Zealand house prices as a average basis, and if you say median and average is going to likely end up similar, you're looking at about 190,000 more expensive. Now that's not the end of the world, but running costs are higher, and I think that general living costs are higher. And the reason that that's been able to happen is because people have been able to borrow, and we have an enormous proportion of interest-only lending. So I think we talked about it a year and a half ago that the average in the UK, at the height of the boom, 18% of lending was on interest-only terms. We've got nearly 30% of lending on interest-only terms, and that is actually rising rapidly at the moment. So we've come out of lockdown, and things have gone crazy again. I think a lot of people have just been pent up. There was a lot of sales that were done prior to lockdown, and people were needed to find houses after lockdown, and I don't know how to describe it. If you're buying and selling in the market, if you sold the house and you've agreed terms pre-lockdown, but you can't move, you can't do anything, removers can't come in, solicitors can't do anything about it, you've got your high price pre-lockdown, and actually you don't mind spending whatever on whatever is available in that post-lockdown market. And there really wasn't a lot available as we came out of lockdown. A lot of people had come off their 90 days on Trade Me. They weren't still in the market. A lot of people withdrawn from the market during the lockdown period. So June, July, not massive stock levels for choice, but probably buyers who'd created, who'd sold beforehand with reasonable money to spend. On top of that, you throw in, a few wage handouts. People have not been able to go and do anything. I mean, I read earlier today that so we've extended the lockdown in Auckland by 4 days, and that's created an enormous amount of noise around. Okay, we've extended the lockdown by 4 days, but why aren't the government extending the wage subsidy by 4 days? I'm thinking, are businesses really that tight? And then if you look at the data, yes, they are. 89% of businesses in Auckland are claiming the wage subsidy. So things are really on a knife edge, and I'm not sure what the momentum's going to do. There's anecdotal reports of agents getting busy again, and I think that there are people who are now looking at situations. I've spoken to people this week who are calling me and they're saying, well, we've got 5 or 6 investment properties. We're thinking about losing 2 or 3 so that we remove our debt position. If there's a lot of people thinking similar thoughts, then we just don't know. We just don't know. I mean, they're doing everything they can to prevent the stress in the market manifesting itself before the election. And I think that with the deferral that we talked about in the mortgage holidays, they're trying to push this back into next year. So, we've got some cities, so Auckland, 6.3% of mortgages are being deferred. Same in Christchurch. Wellington, it's lower, it's in the 3%. But there's a lot of stuff that is being pushed back. Many of the coastal areas, so Tauranga, 7.6% from memory. I think Queenstown was 11% mortgages being deferred. So some of these areas are going to see stress materialise. And when you look at comments from the CEO of NAB today, who's saying, "Well, look, we've increased our staff dealing with these issues from talking to clients about their mortgage challenges, and they've doubled the staff in Australia to deal with these things." Those things, I think, will play themselves out. So we're buying time for the banks at the same time as we're preparing the system for a negative official cash rate.
Yeah, well, we'll come on to negative cash rates because I think that's a very important conversation. We should, explore the RBNZ, frankly, much more transparent articulation of what they're thinking than here in Australia, where the Reserve Bank over here really is just, looking the other way. But just before we do that, a couple of interesting comments. So Matthew on the chat said that up in Northland, it's really, really quiet at the moment, particularly after the lockdown. And so that's not a good sign. And my surveys here in Australia with regard to the SMEs are showing precisely the same issues with, the more recent lockdowns having a very significant negative impact on SMEs. And of course, many SMEs actually have a mortgage on their house to support their business. I'm not sure that many people are fully understanding the implications of that. Certainly here, and I think over there.
Oh, I think that this lockdown in particular was we're now dependent on domestic tourism, and the lockdown just shows you.
Poor connection.
And without them, because it is the. Hello, you with me?
Yeah, you came back. You dropped off. Yeah, you obviously were. You obviously said something which upset somebody along the way.
Auckland. That does upset a lot of people in the rest of New Zealand when you say Auckland. So I've got maybe we should add that to the $10 in the jar thing. But without international tourism, we are dependent on Auckland as the most affluent part of the country, going and travelling around the country. And Queenstown's gone dead again. A lot of other areas that were reliant on people going out, and places like Taupo, places like the Bay of Plenty. Those areas are now finding that there isn't that weekend money that's having a break for 3 or 4 days. We've all been cooped up this year. It's been the most ridiculous year I've ever encountered, and I think many of us will ever encounter. But the restriction on our freedoms has created this. So I've done it again. That's another $10. I want to get out, and I want to go and see something else. I want to get out of my community. I want to get out of my neighbourhood. So. But without the Aucklanders, we've seen the other areas of the country, and I've spoken to business owners this week, and they're like, "Well, yeah, we were fine," and then 2 weeks ago we went quiet because it all has a flow on what you and I would probably refer to as the velocity of money. So if you keep people stuck, that money doesn't go and filter. So GDP gets affected. You don't see the tax take of someone spending money in a coffee shop, the coffee shop owner going and spending money at the painter and decorators while he's doing his house up. The painter and decorator doesn't go and spend his money going and getting his own lawns cut because he's busy. All of those things, they slow the velocity of money. So while we're now on track to have the ability to have another $100 billion added to the economy between now and 2022, newly created fancy money out of nowhere, and I don't think that generally the education of how money is created in the modern economy is well taught in schools, and it's definitely not well taught by the media because they're compromised.
Well, actually, the Reserve Bank here also doesn't believe that money is created when a bank writes a loan, right? Which of course is the way it works, right? It's precisely the reverse way to the traditional way, which is a deposit starts and then you make a loan off the back of it. No. Banks can go on creating more and more loans. Yeah. Well, the bank have been
out for 6 years.
Yep. Didn't make much difference to what they did, though.
No.
There's a nice theoretical discussion over here, but over here we'll just the other way. Now, one question with regard to the New Zealand market, right? Places like Dunedin, somebody was asking earlier on, what's happened to Dunedin? Because Dunedin ran up quite a lot, and it's now dropping quite fast, isn't it?
Yeah, Dunedin was the thing that, and like in Australia, you've seen with Hobart, the thing about the last 2 or 3 years, and the banks are very, very keen to promote credit growth, and credit growth at 2016 was running at nearly 9% of we're seeing domestic household debt increase at 9% over that year. It's at the time that we were competing with the funny money coming in from other parts of the world, and a real major boom. But what's happened is, because people have felt priced out of the markets where they're living and working in, they have gone speculatively and gone into the other areas. So places like Palmerston North, massive increase in property prices. Somewhere, if you go out to New Plymouth, enormous demand for properties over the last year or two, and prices have gone up exponentially. But what that has largely been is people going, and a lot of it either escaping the city because they can't afford to live there anymore, and they just said bollocks to it, we'll go somewhere else. Is bollocks a $10 word?
It's close, but no cigar.
Or they've gone and said, well, what I'll do is I'll go and refinance the family home, and I'll go and buy in one of these regions. Now, like Hobart, Dunedin was the success story of last year. And I've always found it quite interesting, because Dunedin's it's a really cool town, actually. If you ever get a chance to go down there. Is your wife from down there?
Yeah, my wife is from there. Yeah, we go there quite often. Well, until we can't go anymore because of the border shuts. But yeah.
But it's a really cool town, and there's some good stuff going on. They've got a lovely sort of precincts, square middle of town with bars, and you get stuck in Dunedin on a sunny day. It's great fun. Not quite.
When you can find a sunny day, I can tell you, I've been there in the middle of summer and it's blooming cold.
Yeah, I don't have the same sentiment for Invercargill, which is not quite the same. But anyway, people are lovely. They are actually great people down there, but it's not aesthetically as pleasing. Now, these were the areas that a lot of first-home buyers, I can borrow some money, I'll go and buy something there. And I think that's happened. It reminded me very much of what I saw in the UK back in 2004, 5, 6. We had an enormous number of 20-somethings who just couldn't afford to buy in the UK, but they had a 20 grand deposit, and they'd go and buy somewhere like Croatia or Spain or Dubai, or dare I say Ireland as well. And that would be because prices have gone up so fast. You'd be silly not to get in there now. And we know what happened afterwards. So it's the late money to the late money to the party. We're seeing stock levels rise, and I think we shared some graphs on some of these censuses, seeing that happening in Dunedin, the stock levels rise, but also the availability of rental properties rising as well. So that's going to put pressure on rent, and worldwide, so there are major cities now that are seeing some incredible stresses on rent. In New York City, I think they were reporting yesterday 10% fall in rents over the last 2 months. It's crazy.
And Christchurch, a couple of people are asking, of course, in Christchurch with the earthquake and then all the reconstruction, supply demand there, what's going on there?
Yeah, Christchurch is quite a balanced market at the moment, and Christchurch has benefited from government-created money, and there's been an enormous amount of investment over the last couple of years. There hasn't been the same exponential growth in prices. Christchurch suffered after the quakes, and the population reduced, and there was probably an oversupply of housing stock. So while the credit bubble was going rampant around the rest of the country, Christchurch didn't seem to see the same thing. And I keep saying credit bubble because my belief is that lax banking practices, lack of regulation, lack of tools that should have been provided to the Reserve Bank 5 or 6 years ago to temper the amount that people can borrow, and not temper the amount to stop the market, but just temper the amount so that people can actually get to the end of a working career and actually having paid for their house, not still be indebted at 65. Christchurch didn't see that. The population reduced. There's a lot of people that moved in, and it may well have been that the people leaving Christchurch actually created other little pockets where they've gone somewhere else to work. There's a lot of builders who were down here who went up to Tauranga and Bay of Plenty when it started booming, because the build costs were largely the same in the effort, but they were able to go in and a lot more on the finished product. So Christchurch, I think, has probably played catch up. I mean, it is still, if you look at, I think we did a post a year or so ago and we were saying, could Auckland become more expensive than Sydney, because Sydney was dropping at the time and Auckland was still going up. And Christchurch very much was the fifth city. I think it was more expensive than Perth, but not as expensive as Auckland, Melbourne, Wellington, or Sydney. And Sydney was still the clear runner. because there is so much government investment going on, there's still a lot that needs to be rebuilt. There's big complexes, swimming pools. You've got a lot of roading infrastructure, and there's a lot of stock that in Christchurch was removed from the market because it was deemed to be condemned. There are large areas where they've levelled every house that was there, and that's taken stock out of the market, and now they're rebuilding. But Fletcher's, I suppose, probably the most inefficient business that we've actually. Now Fonterra could be more inefficient, but Fletcher's have got a lot of stock around Christchurch that seems to have been built for the international buyer, the small shoeboxes in the middle of town, and without the international tourists, and without the Airbnb, and without the student market, which hasn't dropped off massively. Student numbers were 15% down for July on where they were last year, but it's not the start of a year, not the start of the term. So we'll see what happens in January as to what the real student number changes will be. But I don't think Christchurch saw the same run up, but I don't think that there's the same wage earnings and opportunity in the private sector that maybe there is in some other parts of the country for the bigger earners.
Right. Yeah, and it's quite interesting, isn't it? Just looking across the country and realising that it's quite diverse. And I draw parallels actually to Australia as well, because I've had the chance over the last couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks actually, to research individual postcodes across the country as part of this new one-on-one service that I've been offering, where I actually sit down with somebody and go through a postcode and look at what's going on. And I've been fascinated because I've had quite a lot of requests for regional areas, right, away from Sydney and Melbourne and what have you, right? And it's really fascinating just watching the dynamics and how different they are in regional centres and smaller towns and cities relative to the 2 or 3 large ones. And of course all of the press and all of the media coverage is all of what's happening in Sydney and Melbourne, but they're actually they're missing such a very large part of the overall story. And in some cases, in some of those regional areas, despite tourism disappearing and despite some of the other things going on, the markets are relatively buoyant relative to what's happening in Sydney and Melbourne. So I think there's an interesting observation, which is that you have to go granular, as we keep saying, and you have to recognise that things aren't behaving the same way. And here's the question where I was heading to, Joe. Metrics, data. In New Zealand, there is very little good data other than the very high-level stuff, isn't there? So, how do people get a sense of what's really going on, or do they just rely on the media, and to what extent does the media actually tell the right story, the full story, or whatever?
You set me up for this one, aren't you?
Just remember the swear jar.
Yeah, the data is out there, but you have to hunt very hard for it, and the stuff that's published by REINZ is not complete. I've took a return to Christchurch. I would say that Christchurch currently has a 3-speed market. You've got the lower end of the market where prices seem to be rocketing up. They've removed the barriers for entering the market, so you no longer need a deposit. So you can go and buy, if you've got stable income, you can go and buy a house without a deposit. Whereas previously there was a restriction, was people were having to save money to do that, and that was limiting the pool. Now anyone can do it, providing your income's okay. Now, the middle sector of the market also seems to be quite strong, and I said for Christchurch, lower end of the market, 350 to 500, middle sector of the market, 500 to 750 also seems pretty strong. As you go north of 750 and upwards, and particularly noticeable as you go over $1 million, the market is slower, and there isn't the transaction volume. That contrasts very differently to Auckland, where Mike Kirk's provided some really good information for us over the last few months, where they're playing catch up on the number of transactions this year, but transactions are still over the 6 or 7 months of the year so far well down, a lot less money being created than there was previously. But there has actually been an uplift and a sharper uptick in transactions at the upper end of the market than there is in the lower and middle, where you're relying on New Zealanders buying and taking on debt. So their two-speed market is totally different to the two-speed market that we've got, or three-speed market that we've got down in Christchurch. And every part of the country is performing differently. Central Auckland apartments, there are no Airbnb lets. There is very little, reduced number of students. That lower end, referred to others Rabbit Hutch or shoebox apartments, they're being hammered, and there is very, very little demand. The stock levels are going up for rent, and rents are falling, and people just aren't interested in them. It's difficult to get granular, and I think that my advice to anybody is to go and seek a good agent, seek an agent who's prepared to talk to you about the information within your area, and if you do need to get that information, all real estate agents in New Zealand have got an REINZ database. Sit down with them on the computer and say, look, can you show me what's going on in the area? There are some good websites out there. Homes.co.nz is a useful tool. The challenge with some of the information out there is that I've got to be careful here. New Zealanders are an incredibly trusting people, and they give the shirt off their back to look after a guest or a visitor, and they're incredibly genuine and honest, and they do believe the information that the government tell them. For many years, and this is not something I've seen in many other countries around the world, but the government values your house. So every 2 or 3 years, the government values your house, and that's it. That's what it's worth. And therefore, a buyer, if the bank's prepared to lend them the money to do it, doesn't mind paying a government valuation, because the government's told me it's okay, and the banks have also told me I'm prepared to lend. And then what I feel is that in the background, there's the media who are largely at the behest of the banks and the government, who are supporting this incredible credit growth that we've seen. And why have house prices doubled since 2010-11? It's because we've gone from $126 billion worth of household debt, and this is not including other private sector debt in farms and businesses. We've gone from $126 billion to $285 billion now. So our debt has exponentially gone up greater than that. When we grew GDP by 4.5% in 2016, we grew household debt by 9%. So that's the thing, but the government supports it with the re-ratings. The local authorities love a slightly higher government valuation because they charge higher tax on the ownership and the property rights and your rates and your insurances. So it's just a funny system. And if ever there was an economy that was so dependent on one asset class, this is it. I'm perplexed by it still, but it fascinates me.
Well, it is amazing. And, if you look at Australia and New Zealand, you can draw some quite strong parallels, right, with effectively significant bank lending into both property markets. In fact, the ratios are relatively similar, although actually Australia wins just by a short head. In fact, we did you remember we did 1 year quite a long ago where we actually compared the different economies, and we scored them on different dimensions, right? We should recommend that one. It's quite interesting, although some of the parameters have changed. The level of debt growth is much stronger in New Zealand than Australia at the moment, and that's partly to do with central bank settings and partly to do with bank lending policy, and partly also to do with you got out of lockdown quicker, although that's come back a little bit. But both economies are hugely exposed to the property sector, and I would say that the banks in both Australia and New Zealand with regard to property are too big to fail, because if they did fail, then they'd pull the whole economies down, right? So it takes us to an interesting discussion about, in a situation where you start seeing unemployment rising, which is rising in both countries now. In Australia, they're talking now about a real unemployment rate of about 13%. And if you include underemployment, then it's more than 20%. So that's a huge increase from where it was, which means we've got more people who are going to struggle with making those mortgage repayments. Now, I'm sure there's a very similar story in New Zealand. I don't know what the current unemployment rate is in New Zealand. I tried to look it up, but I couldn't.
It's pretty low. The last data is historic. We are very slow to report the information. So we'll get the June quarter, from March to June quarter GDP numbers probably the end of September. That will encompass a large part of the lockdown period, and then we won't really know what's happened June to September until just before Christmas. So data and stats seem to be a lot slower. I'm not sure why, because we have so many people who are employed by the government that surely this information could get out quicker. But official unemployment is at 4% and has fallen.
Did you say 4%?
4%, yeah.
Wow. And this is post the COVID?
It's the June, the data for up to the end of June.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Because I saw that one, but I couldn't see anything later, but now I understand why, because it's too early.
Yes,
right.
Too early.
But that's remarkably low, isn't it?
Yeah, they said the same about Ireland, though, in 2067 when unemployment was 4%, and we did a post on the macro comparisons there a year and a half ago. So the stats are there, but I said earlier, 89% of Auckland businesses are on government guaranteed wage subsidies, and we've extended that across the whole country. So you've got an enormous amount of companies out there they've gone survive lockdown. I think because we everybody likes spending money, and you're locked up for 2 months, you go and have a splurge. And I think initially we had a big splurge. We've gone and spent a load of money on spas and cars, and car sales were excellent in June and July. People are saying, well, it's because people can't go abroad on holiday, they're spending on this. But yeah, a lot of people weren't earning any money during lockdown. The wage subsidies are there, and they probably helped to finance a purchase of something. So we've had a sugar hit. The sugar hit's run out. We've then locked Auckland down again. We'll give people an opportunity to build up some cash and go and spend it again in a week or so's time. And we'll have another sugar hit. The banks have been told that by December the 1st they need to have their systems in place to prepare for a negative official cash rate. Really interesting conversation between a guy called Gareth Vaughan and Jared Kerr, who's the chief economist at Kiwibank earlier today. And Jared Kerr, I don't think is that keen on negative official cash rates. He thinks that there are other things that the Reserve Bank could do first. Funding for lending programs as a support of a big cut in official cash rate. When they go, and I think they're going to, and I called it at breakfast at it said a year ago. I think they're going to go. I think they're going to go big. I think they're going to go to negative 0.5%. I think we're going to see mortgage rates down at somewhere in the early 2%, deposit rates at 1%, and we're going to try and give it one more go, because we're so reliant on debt growth, and credit growth is a nice way of saying it. It's debt growth to keep the money flowing through the system. That it's our only option. My concerns, and these are concerns where New Zealand does produce a lot of good agricultural product, but we've largely run a trade deficit for the last 30, 40 years. We'll go negative. Now Japan's gone negative. Japan's a major export-led economy, and Sweden's gone negative, and they do produce a lot of manufactured goods. We go negative, and we produce some very good primary produce, and we've got some very good tech stuff going on. But we don't have the trade surpluses that Japan has to go negative. And at the same point, we've got a demographic problem, which I've highlighted a few times.
Well, let's just spare a bit more time on the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, because Adrian Orr, actually, if you look at his recent speeches, has made more transparent declarations about what's on his mind than almost any central banker around the world. And actually, kudos to him for doing that. I mean, he didn't look very comfortable when he was doing it, to be frank. But, he said things like, well, we're going to have to, increase our balance sheet. We're going to actually have to lend more. He said negative interest rates is one of the things he's thinking about, as many others, and was quite open, I think, about that. Whereas in Australia, Phil Lowe, in the most recent outing, sort of pretty much said it's hardly on the agenda, but didn't completely dismiss it, whereas last year he did. So he's sort of moving slightly towards it. And some of the other things that they've said, which is that they want to, pull all the levers they've got and use all of their tools to try and basically help the economy. So, I mean, what's your perspective in terms of Adrian Orr and his, his narrative, and how's it being reported in the local media in New Zealand?
Well, that's that. I think the thing about Adrian, and I actually quite like the guy. I think he's a straight shooter. I think he talks a fairly straight game. He's not going to say we're in the shit, because he's not. You can't do that. You just perpetuate a problem. But I quite like the way he does it. The thing about Adrian Orr, and this is where I suppose he has an advantage over most central bankers. So former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, talks. It's in the Financial Times, the Telegraph, it's in the Times, it's in the Daily Mail, and it gets reported and it's on the news. Mervyn King before him, he talked, these things would get reported and you'd see them in the news. What happens here is that he can pretty much say whatever the hell he likes, because nobody's bloody interested in watching. The last financial stability report, and I commented on it, that it wasn't up online, and it wasn't 24 hours after it had happened. It wasn't on the Reserve Bank website. They've got a YouTube channel, and if anyone goes and looks at that now, that last thing, of Christian Hawkesby was there, and who I think is a smart cookie. There's probably been about 100 people look at it, and if 100 people that are watching this go and watch that, they'll double the numbers, because it just doesn't get promoted anywhere. So I think it's very easy to be a straight shooter when you know that anything you say isn't going to be seen in the mainstream press.
Yeah, very interesting.
So that's my view on it. If the journalism in New Zealand, there's a difference between reporting and journalism. Reporting, you get spoon-fed something and you just repeat it, and then journalism is going fact-finding and digging and finding out information and questioning, and we don't have very many journalists anymore. And those, I think, that in the past have been confident enough to speak out about things that were wrong, have either been sidelined and pushed away, or they no longer have a voice. They've lost their jobs. So.
Yeah, interesting. And
it's one of the reasons, to be fair, I got in touch with you in the first place. I kept reading the papers and looking at the news and thinking, crap, this is a nightmare. I better call Martin North and get in touch with him and start having a voice.
Well, I was on ABC News Radio this morning at quarter to 8, talking about all the stimulus, and it was fascinating. The line of questioning that they sort of went through was very, very high level, but I realised that they were actually trying to sort of at least get a bit of a debate going. But I noticed that in New Zealand, the level of debate is not that sophisticated. I think the other point is I actually think
we don't have the people that want to know. We have a lot of very, very intelligent people that really do want to find out.
I know. Yeah.
There's no avenue for them to find it.
Yeah. Well, I should watch DFA, and we'll try and do more on New Zealand as part of the DFA show, right? Because we've got more viewers than the Reserve Bank of New Zealand.
That's good to know.
That's not saying much, really, but but the interesting observation is that central banks around the world are all basically following the same model, which is print more money, throw more liquidity into the system, support the banks, take rates lower, try and manage rates down, consider the possibility of negative rates. Now, Jerome Powell said that they probably won't do negative rates in the US, but he would, wouldn't it? Because in the US, the Reserve Bank, of course, is, or the Fed, it's a reserve currency, but it's also owned by the banks, right? Yeah. So it's not actually even in the interests of everyday Americans. At least in Australia and New Zealand, the central bank is a little bit more independent. Although how much is an interesting question. The other point to make about the structure, though, in New Zealand is that you don't have lots of separate regulators like in Australia, where you've got ASIC and APRA and the Reserve Bank and ACCC. It's a bit more concentrated, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, but I think there's blurred lines between what the Financial Conduct Authority can do and the Reserve Bank are responsible for. And I don't think that, because I've been in touch with both sides to say, well, who's responsible for actually regulating how much money is being lent? Oh, that's something that the Reserve Bank deal with. Okay, well, who's responsible for the money laundering and fraud? Well, or that's something that they deal with? Or do you guys talk to each other about the two? And they're probably in offices about 10 metres apart, but I think we have got some missing regulatory framework. There's some crazy stuff. We introduced money laundering regulations back in the UK in 2014 because I remember sitting on a real estate committee, which was part of the National Institute. You've got REI and Z over here, but similar body, and they were saying, well, we've got an enormous amount of money coming in, and at the time it was places Greece, Russia, and China, Hong Kong, Singapore. Enormous amount of money hitting the London market, inflating.
Oh,
I was just spilling into. You there?
Yeah, you come back again. Yep.
You lost me?
Yeah.
The money was spilling to London, and then it was damaging and creating massive spikes in markets that were outside London. Now we curbed that with changes to stamp duty and big stamp duty increases for anyone who bought from overseas. But we also introduced money laundering, and this is a thing for me that, is this all joined up? So money laundering regulations in the UK we'll check the identity and the information around who's selling the house, but we'll also make sure that we check the identity information and where the funds are coming for the purchaser. Surely they're the ones that are starting the money laundering process. Now in New Zealand, our money laundering regulations only refer to the seller of the house, and have got nothing to do with them. So we've got an overseas buyer ban, but you can sort of circumvent it by setting up a company registered in New Zealand, and off you go. But nobody's checking where the money from the buyers are coming from. And you go to speak to agents, and we've had these offers. Well, is anybody checking what the deposit level is, what the likelihood is of getting credit, what the multiple of income is? Because surely you need to have those information, particularly if you've got 2 or 3 offers on a house, to go and ascertain who the best buyer is most likely to do it. That never seems to be a problem because it's just accepted that the valuation will stack up. Oh, it's a GV or whatever, but there isn't that same scrutiny, and I don't think that the systems and processes that probably other larger economies have been able to get in place earlier have been applied. It's been it should be right, mate. A bit like Australia, but we've reached headache point because we've been too slow getting these things organised.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting on that, Joe. And interesting, Matthew just put a post up on the chat saying Kiwis are not taught to be critical debate, as like Canadians, they just want to be nice. So there is a bit of a cultural thing there. Yeah, they are, absolutely.
And for years and years and years, lots, and the UK's been no different. I mean, we've been, and you've lived over there as well. Everything was done on the shake of the hand, and a deal was done, and maybe other influences have made us more cynical, questioning. I don't know.
Yeah, and Cloudy Bits says the New Zealand Herald is just the spokesperson of the bank and real estate lobby, which I think sort of echoes what you said a little while ago, right?
Yeah, well, they've set up a paywall this year, and I can't believe anybody would pay to read it. You'd have to, well, people do. They still operate. Although I think somebody asked on one of our last posts, are they taking government subsidy as well? 89% of Auckland businesses are. So my guess is they are. I can't wait. I'll tell you what, if they disappear stuff as well. Oh, blimey! I've got to stop. That's the two major news outlets in New Zealand.
Well, yes, and of course it's quite concentrated, isn't it? Bearing in mind if you
do want some educated discovery and there's still a lot of sproiking, and a lot of people have got vested interest who feature in comment sections, but interest.co.nz is still the only site that I would say is worth looking at, because the readership are pretty intelligent.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I have a look at that one from time to time, and certainly of all the stuff in New Zealand, it's the one that I come back to. The other point, of course, is there's no equivalent to my survey work in New Zealand at all, is there? So trying to get a handle on household finances, mortgage stress, all of those things, I mean, there's just no data.
No, well, we got our little bits from Centrix the other day about the mortgage deferrals by region. The Reserve Bank published data. The Reserve Bank, I still question, and I'd love to get in there for a few days and just say, right, okay, can you show me all the loans that were reported against new purchases last month, and actually do those loans correlate with the number of purchases that the REI instead are reporting? Because there's a massive imbalance, and I still don't believe the Reserve Bank of New Zealand really have a clue on what the general size of new lending and new mortgages is, and the number of loans that people are taking out against properties. And I've touched on this in previous posts, but I talk to people who have, in some cases, 3, 4, and 5 loans against a dwelling, normally with the same lender, but in tranched tiers, so something on a 6-month term, something on a 12-month, something on a 2-year, something on a 3-year. But I don't think the Reserve Bank really understand how the concentration of debt is factoring the market. We talk about what the average mortgage of a New Zealander is, but a third of our housing stock is, pretty much like Australia. A third of our housing stock is mortgage free and owner occupied. You've got a third that is mortgaged, and then you've got another third that is mortgaged with a tenant in it. So we've got a really funny market. We've got about 2.5% of the housing stock is empty, i.e. owned but not resided in, either for rental or otherwise. And you've got about 2.4% of properties that are Airbnbs. It's about 40,000 houses that are Airbnbs, and they're being used by the local community at the moment. Apart from the Aucklanders aren't getting anywhere. But yeah, there's weird things, but you have to dig in all sorts of places to find the data.
Well, I'll tell you a little story here. I actually tried to start doing my survey in New Zealand about 6-7 years ago, right? And I basically rang round all of the major players in New Zealand, the banks and central bank, and sort of to try and see whether there'd be any appetite or interest to be able to actually participate and pay to get it, but not pay a lot to get it, right? Thinking, well, it's laid down as there. It would be really helpful, wouldn't it, to know where things are and and understand household debt. And it was amazing to a institution. Every institution said, no, we don't need that.
You troublemaker.
I know. Well, but it seems so obvious.
How dare you try and shine a light on us all that?
Well, my definition is to
the Australian.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say. And I've been doing the surveys here in Australia since 2002, right? And I've been talking about some of these, debt bubbles and everything else over that period of time. And so people saying, well, you've been saying that for a long time. Well, I have, because the market's been going in the same direction for a long time, right? But at least there's now a recognition, even from some of the media, that this data set is actually really potent and important now, given where we are with what's going on in terms of personal finance and with all the debt issues and the rising level of defaults. But you've got no compass over there, so
no, we don't, and it's difficult. I mean, we were at a point that, like Australia, the minute that debt's deleveraged or people start paying it back faster than new people are taking it on at a faster rate, money gets destroyed in the economy and things start falling over. These lockdowns have been an interesting experiment, and the merits of how you feel about it, the economic cost versus the social cost. I think that there will be a societal cost later, because I do think that it will have an impact on people's well-being, and I'm not a big believer of go and sit at work at home and do it on your own all day, because I think you need a human interaction. You need to kind of talk to people and actually get that in your life, and you can do it. You can go for a walk down the beach or whatever, meet up with your mates at a public restaurant. But I think there is a lot to be said for, I look at some of the best friends I've got, people I've worked with for 5, 10, 15 years, and I call them up from time to time, have a yarn. I don't need to speak to them all the time, but it's you've been through things together and you've done it in the same surroundings. I think that's good. So we'll see how this experiment goes. I mean, I think that we will curb our current outbreak. I think that Auckland will probably get back to normal Sunday night. I hope. And we'll get back to whatever the new normal is. But I think the new normal has to factor in that as we go over the next few months, the wage subsidies are going to come to an end very shortly. and those Auckland figures, 89% business, crazy. We are going to see an impact of people who are going to be spoken to by their bank about their loan positions, and NAB's CEO in Australia saying how many people, I think it's 135,000 people that they've got a loan, and 250,000 to speak to between now and Christmas about their circumstances. And that's one bank. We're going to see these unwind, and I just think it's important that people have an open discussion and have something other than it always goes up. I mean, I saw a couple of articles there was one in Stuff today, and it's written by a guy who he runs a fund which has been going for a few years, not for profit. And his advice was, the first thing you do is you go out there and you buy as big a house as you can with as much debt as you can. And I'm thinking, oh crap, how's this been published? Because no consideration of, we've got all of these people who are in mortgage stress. We've got no tourists. We've got there's no wider thinking. It's all too small, isolated concepts based on someone's position, and those people own. They're the ones who are quoted in the press, and they own. They're writing the articles pretty much for the newspapers. It's crazy.
Yep. Well, it's a self-perpetuating circle, isn't it? Which we've been talking about before and highlight again, and then you overlay the indices that, of course, are all connected as well.
Yeah.
One of the questions that are coming on the live chat here is.
I can't see those of that.
No, I know. That's why I'm just telling you now. So one of the interesting questions that's been coming up is a bit the New Zealand attitude to the lockdown and how that was reacted, and was there a lot of people thinking that it was too draconian? I mean, there's a lot of discussion in Melbourne at the moment because the talk there is that they're talking about extending the state of emergency for another year in Melbourne, and there are people speculating that the lockdown could be running for months and months more, and people are talking civil liberties and all those things, right? I mean, was there any of that in New Zealand, or was people just rolling over?
I think that there was wide support for the first lockdown, and sentiment for it was, yeah, we'll do it. The big celebrations afterwards, and Team of 5 Million got us through this. And New Zealand, I actually love that about this place. They do pull together, and we're a little country, 5 million people, whip everyone's arse at rugby, and it's just it's a great thing. There's this whole leave the jersey in a better shape than when you picked it up, and I like that. I think that the recent experience of going back into lockdown has created definitely more. There was support between the two parties before, back in March. There's definite bickering now between National and Labour, and the other parties are there, but National and Labour are trying to hammer each other. And this four-day extension to lockdown wage deferral payments is just an example from today. But I think that the business community now have had enough, and I think that some of them will have seen the sugar hit. The end of May, June, July, pretty rosy. First couple of weeks of July, possibly things were a bit different. And if you speak to a few business owners, they were saying that things weren't quite as rosy as they had been in June. I don't think we've got the appetite for extending it for much longer. If there are regional outbreaks, that maybe other areas would suffer another lockdown. But I think politically it'd be really, really difficult for Jacinda to go and extend beyond this Sunday. And I think that she knows it. We've got an election that's been pushed back. It's 50 odd days now to that taking place. And I think politically there's a lot of pressure now being exerted, and the banks know that there's a headache brewing if we don't open up. Because to be fair, our headache's your headache, and you're creating all sorts of challenges for our banking sector over there.
Well, that's true, and of course,
this is the thing, yeah.
Yeah, New Zealand, the Reserve Bank, of course, in New Zealand forced separation of capital, so there wasn't the ability to sort of switch it across the pond, whereas they were previously doing that, right? So that created a big set of heartburn here in Australia. But of course, now the banks here can get massive amounts of very cheap loans from the Reserve Bank, and my belief is that will go on for quite a lot longer. And of course, they've also extended the repayment holiday into next year. And whilst APRA has said, well, people should, have a conversation on a one-on-one basis and see who's actually still got problems and who hasn't, right? And those processes are running. Westpac's, I think, spoken about 85% of their deferred loan holders, but only a small proportion have come back on. A lot of them are still deferred. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but there's a lot of support coming in from the central bank, and everything is being controlled to try and actually allow things to continue. So, for example, firms can trade in terms that they wouldn't normally be allowed to trade through. For example, they've changed the legislation for that. Another example. So wherever you look, they've shifted all the goalposts.
We've had exactly the same in business here. So the extension to government-backed loans for businesses, which, to be fair, the uptake hadn't been what they were expecting first time round, and they've extended to larger companies and increased the amount that they're now prepared to lend to these businesses. But you can't, Governor Orr said it, you can't force people to borrow, and there comes a point where it's a really weird world at the moment, because you've got some people going gangbusters. When I'm hearing of agents who are having houses with, I'm not talking one or two offers, but a dozen, 15 offers come forward on a Monday morning after a Sunday open home, and then a lot of businesses are the same and saying, well, I'm 25% down on my normal where I would be over the course of July or the course of August, and this is outside Auckland, so we're in a weird time, and I think there comes a point that you just have to say, okay, well, let's just deal with it. My feelings are that we're giving money to the wrong sectors of the economy, and people will go and spend money that they're given. They'll go and spunk it on things that they shouldn't. And really, we need a proper business lobby and people who've got, okay, that's it, right, sod it, this is what we're doing, and let's go and raise money for some serious ventures in things that we're good at. We've got a lot of tech stuff that we could really get into. We've got a lot of capability to go and automate house building, and not ship a product halfway around the world and back again finished. So there's lots of things that we've got to do, but that's where the credit creation needs to go into. We've saturated the. Oh no, actually no, we haven't. I think we've still got a little bit longer to run on the swapping houses with each other for a bit more money each time, but how long, I'm not sure.
One interesting question came up from Nifi. Migration's been a hot topic in Australia. Difficult policy with high unemployment. Any similar discussions in New Zealand?
Do you know, this is a really interesting one for me, because we went through credit crunch in the UK, 8, 9, 10, absolute bloody mess. Unemployment rose. Theresa May, who was the Home Secretary at the time and was put in charge of, to be fair, everything she was put in charge of, she fucked up. She didn't manage to Brexit either. But
that's another $10.
$10. But during her tenure, and in the Cameron administration, our immigration levels went up exponentially. We're reporting that 500,000 net a year. So we were losing people, but we're reporting about 500,000 a year as a net result. And if you look at the stats numbers, population went from 61 to 66, 67 million over a 10-year period after the GFC, so between 8 and 18. So it doesn't matter. If a government choose to close a blind eye, they'll do it. And governments know, because it's tried and tested, that more people create pressure on fixed resources until something else gets built, and building is a double whammy credit growth. Something is borrowed to build it, and someone else borrows even more money to go and buy it when it's done. And if you provide new borrowers, you provide more opportunity to grow your credit. And New Zealand's seen the fastest pace in the developed world of the percentage increase in population over the last 10 years. So it's a really difficult one to justify when you get unemployment of 13-14%. But I don't think you'll turn the taps off in Australia, and I don't think we will do here. I think we're going to see a push. Sorry, we'll see population saying we don't think.
You just dropped out for a second. Luckily, that was probably good timing. You dropped out.
Good. I think it's one of the few models they know.
Yeah, yeah. So I agree. I think that the migration lever will be pulled again because essentially there's no other. We've had a quantitative easing approach, which is population expansion, right? That's our version of quantitative easing over the last 10 years or so, right? So just make the country bigger, bring more people in, GDP number goes up because you have more people. Okay, it creates more of a crush because we don't have the infrastructure to support it. Helps to build more houses. You can sort of see the logical argument.
Creates more activity, more people doing things, and a higher velocity of money transfer.
Yeah, exactly right. But nobody's thinking about, one, the quality of life, two, what happens to the people in the country who are trying to get jobs, and three, the fact that this is just an artificial, Ponzi scheme that gets bigger, but actually doesn't create real more value. And
it's one of the reasons I'm in the UK, Martin. I used to get up in the morning at 6, and I'd leave the house about 6:30. To get to an office for 7 o'clock, and I realised that I had to do that because if I left my house at 5 to 7, I wouldn't get into the office till 8 o'clock. Now, 10 or 15 years before, when I first started doing the same journey, I'd get to the office. It didn't matter what time I left, I'd get there in 10 minutes. But you're dealing with more of everything on limited infrastructure, and New Zealand has an opportunity to improve its infrastructure if it directs spending in the right direction, but there'll be everybody's clamoring for I want it here and I want it there, and as long as we don't waste too much time or waste too much money on all the politicking and just get the hell on with it, that shouldn't be a bad thing, because we have got a need to speed the movement of goods around the country to the ports and get them out, because there's so many people who, October through to March, you get logging trucks stuck in traffic for hours, and that sort of extra wage costs, extra time lost, extra all of those things, and just make us inefficient. So the roading needs to be improved. It will affect a few communities where roads don't any longer go through a high street, but we've got to speed our movement up.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, there is definitely a place for strategic investment into things to make the countries, both Australia and New Zealand, better into the future. But I don't think that's just throwing more money at the construction sector to build more cheap homes to try and actually persuade first-time buyers to come in and, put their savings into it at the tooth of the market and see them erode. And this, go on.
As long as we're not all investing in having face masks manufacturing operations as well, because we're on that from Monday. Public transport. If you're getting an Uber,
right?
Not looking forward to it. I'm going to struggle.
All right. Okay. Very good. Now, two last topics before we close off. We're about 20 minutes from the end of the show. The first one: real estate agents in New Zealand. Right? Are they independent? Are they owned by big chains? And are they growing? Are they shrinking? Are they profitable? Are they not profitable? What's going on there?
It's a totally different model to the one that I'm used to operating in the UK. In the UK, the chains are owned by owners, and we employ staff. Typically, staff are paid a salary, and the businesses are more streamlined in that you have specialist valuers, specialist salespeople, and specialist viewing guides, and people perform different functions, get paid differently depending on what they do. But the employer has the responsibility for paying a salary, so training levels quite high, and the business is on much lower margins, so fees typically between 1 and 1.25% in the UK now, plus VAT. They're more systemised, they're more efficient. The model in Australia and New Zealand is similar between the two countries. The brands, many of whom have formed part of I suppose, old established families who set up a brand 100 years ago and carried on. Typically, your agents are self-employed contractors to the brand. They get paid quite large proportions of the selling fee, and that can vary from 40% to 70, 75%, depending on brand. But many of them are, because of those high fee levels, able to do it part-time. And there's what I would call a lot of non-professional real estate agents. And just to give you an example, the average real estate agent in New Zealand last year sold 4.27 houses per annum. There were nearly 16,000 registered real estate agents at the beginning of last year, and that fell to just over 15,000 registered real estate agents at the end of last year, with a transactional base of just under 80,000 units. So it's tight. I think 76,000 units, I think it was. So you do get a lot of people who are doing it to subsidise a pension and retirement. It's a pin money job, and they rock up at an open home on a Sunday and they show a few people around and close the door. And they're not what I would call really knowledgeable about the marketplace. The access to data is inefficient. You don't get reports provided by the major web portals to really get granular, because they don't want that to happen. So yeah, it's a very different model. We I think we'll see the number of real estate agents decrease for a little while, because the transactions, the numbers have had a little bit of a bounce recently, but I'm not anticipating them being enormous over the next period, with cushions for people being able to stay in their houses with the reduced mortgage rates and everything else. So I don't think we're going to see volumes rise. And in the UK, the volumes of 2006, 7, 8 never returned, and they only ever got back to about 80% by 2015, 16. So different model, completely different model. And I don't think it's as well policed and regulated. A lot of stuff's done on the end of a mobile phone from someone's kitchen, rather than being in an office where things are recorded and indelible and tracked. And the Real Estate Institute and the bodies governing it, actually.
Careful.
As good as a chocolate teapot.
Very good. Okay, last subject for tonight. You are very hot on thinking about the different types of borrowers, right? And the different types of households. And first-time buyers, baby boomers, property investors. I just want to unpick that a little bit. So one of the things you did a year or so ago was drive around and see all of these new estates that were clearly being targeted at first-time buyers, and you were concerned about that and the implications for those first-time buyers.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of construction on the peripheral areas of many of the major New Zealand cities, with the exception of Wellington, where the topography just means that it's difficult. A lot of these areas have, because the centres became pumped by the marginal buyer, who was either the foreign purchaser bringing in money from wherever, competing against New Zealanders who were borrowing and going heavy on leverage. But a lot of normal purchases have got pushed out to the periphery, and there's been huge developments all over the place for those markets. My concern is that just talked about that average value of say UK or a USA against a New Zealand, that people have paid a lot of money, like you're seeing in your some of the peripheral Sydney suburbs and Melbourne suburbs. There's been a lot of people who've leveraged up heavy and have been given incentives to borrow with very low deposit levels on new build financing. It's fine if they're happy living there for a long time. And we were already seeing an uptick. So 2 or 3 years ago, the average length of time that New Zealander was owning a house was about 4 years, and that's up to 7 now. And I think that that's going to keep on going up. So I think that people are going to be in the houses for longer. If they're comfortable, jobs get safe, they'll be okay. If jobs get affected, these people will see themselves coming back to the market and competing with a lot of new stuff. We are building. We're building at a pace that we've not seen since the 1970s, when we were building for the baby boomers, and the pace of finished consents is still very, very high in very, very uncertain terms. So anyone who looks at those drive-arounds, and we did them in was it out and about in sunny New Zealand, the post around Taronga, and we looked at and that's not even going into commercial side of things, but we also looked at three drive-arounds Auckland. This huge amount of stuff that was being built, and a lot of that's still there, and people are returning to the market 2 or 3 years later, 4 years later, thinking, I'm going to take a capital gain, but they're now competing with stuff that's brand new and on at the same price. So yeah, funny time. The middle market, I don't worry so much about things. You know, if it's a family home and it's a family home and you're planning on spending your life there, it's not the end of the world. And if it's in the right spot for bringing kids up, having a life, then bloody do it. It's just convenient. The top end of the market, this is the interesting one, because low interest rates, negative official cash rates force people to do things that maybe they wouldn't do otherwise. Now, there's a talk about, we've got a savings glut, but you and I know that half of New Zealand households have less than $5,000 worth of cash savings, so that's not true. Not for the majority. Might be for a few, but it's not for the majority. Now, and was it 90% of New Zealand households have less than $50,000 worth of cash savings? So that for me, that's a cushion to see you through if you lose a job and you need to work on something for a year or so. So we don't have a savings glut, but when you're hitting retirement and you've got, I think a lot of people who are in that 1955 birth year hits retirement this year, it's 65 this year, and we know the next few years that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, if you were planning on, I've got $200,000 or $300,000, I'm going to take my state pension, and I'm going to be earning 4 or 5% return on my interest. That's a very, very different situation to what these people are going to be looking at, because term deposit rates are going to fall into the 1%. And that's going to have consequences. You'll have choice. I leverage up again and buy an investment property. So I'll borrow more. But that
keep going again. Yeah,
keep going again. But that will reduce your capital for the nice things you might want to do, the foreign adventure, if we're allowed to do those anymore. But it's going to force other decisions. So I'm not sure. Actually, do you know what? Property is such a religion in New Zealand that I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of people who do just say, I'll leverage up again. It's close to me needing that retirement pool. I'll leverage up. Because the returns on deposits are going to be so low.
Well,
funny time. So they're probably like you. They're the people who I think are probably going to see the biggest shock to what their expectations were for their future.
Well, it's very interesting looking at the surveys here in Australia. I'm looking in more detail at two groups. Firstly, property investors, because many of them are seeing rentals drop, the capital appreciation they were expecting not happening, and because of the multiple leverage that many of them have, the dominoes being to fall over. So that's one group. But the other ones are the down traders, right? The 1 million plus people who've been sitting in a property for a good number of years, seen it ride up, sitting on a chunk of equity, but knowing that now they're going to have to do something because term deposits are through the floor. Dividends are not being paid by some of those big companies that normally pay dividends, like some of the banks, and so they've got a cash flow issue. Yeah. And the question for them is, should they jump soon to try and release maximum equity, or should they ride it through, hoping that any falls are limited and that there will be a return once migration comes back and once the property investors come back in again, right? I mean,
it's difficult. I mean, my experience of the UK was that we had prices peak in 2007-8, and there were house prices then that were, I mean, they were astronomical. It was phenomenal what was happening in that really relaxed credit environment that we'd had. There are a lot of people who, after that happened, the market where I was operating dipped, and it fell in 3 stages. So the top end got hammered. The middle end, where you're dealing with what I'd call essential family homes, did fall, but not to the same extent. So the percentage drops were bigger the higher up the tree you went, and the lower end actually stayed quite flat. And the reason it stayed flat was because either people got trapped and couldn't sell, so it was first time entry homes, or lower margin homes. And a lot of those people, when they did trade, they were competing in the middle market with those who were trying to trade down and those who just needed more space to have a family. So what we found, though, was that as you went through 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, the top end of the market never recovered. But the expectations of the sellers, my friend sold that house down the road that's just like mine in 2008. I'm not selling mine unless I get 1.5 million. Okay, fine. I can't be bothered to have your house on my books because I can't get you any more than 1.2. And that was actually the reality of it. So the volume of transactions at the top end for many years, it was, okay, well, the expectations are up here on something that in their mind, they had that 300 grand to buy the holiday home in Spain. And I've talked stories about this before in some of our other posts. The loss, the perceived loss. It's a bit like when you hold on to a stock, and I've done it recently with a couple of things I bought last year. So hold on to a stock and it goes down and you think, oh, don't worry, it'll get better, and then it doesn't, and then it goes down, and you sit on it for another 6 months, and then you think, oh, for fuck's sake.
A dog is a dog is a dog.
A dog is a dog is a dog. But if you look at it and you think, well, it'll get better, you could end up wasting your retirement in that house that's got 7 bedrooms that you're heating that you don't need, and not doing the things that you should be doing because trust me, there's a big difference to the energy levels that I've seen people have in the 65 to 75 bracket and then the 75 to 85 bracket. The things you're capable of doing and want to do it. Get on with it. Well, anyway, I can't tell people about their own lives, but I saw many people who ended up being sold as probate sales when actually they should have just moved 10 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And certainly my research is indicating that many people are sitting on that dilemma at the moment and trying to work out what to do. And it's really, it's a devil of a dilemma, particularly, of course, because ahead, if inflation starts running quite, rapidly, then you could actually see the value of any credit outstanding relatively dropping, right? Whereas if we go into a deflationary environment, effectively capital values drop and you're still stuck with a loan, then you've got this massive noose around your neck, as it were, as well. So, this is a very complex environment. And I've said several times, I can't yet pick whether we're going to get inflation or deflation. I know all the gold bugs say, oh, it's going to be inflation and we need gold because that will protect us, right? But it could be deflationary. And if it is deflationary, then the strategies need to be very different. So all I say to people at the moment is my own view is I'm watching for the indicators because I don't know which way it's going to jump. But I mean, it's just really, really tricky.
I'm not sure if I'm perfectly honest. There's so much leverage in the system that the system we've created and negative official cash rates, they're going to be everywhere within the next year or two.
Yep.
Is all to stave off deflation. Short term, I think you can see it in food prices, you can see it in various other things. I think we're going to see a spike on that. Supply chains have been very, very disrupted, and the passage of, because I'm waiting for some floor tiles at the moment for an office that I've taken on recently, and they've been stuck on a container in Auckland for the last month, and I'm like, well, when are they coming down? But it is just what it is. So there is a lot of disruption, and disruption of supply does tend to create a little bounces of inflation. But we'll see. They're doing everything they can to stop deflation.
Yep. And at the moment, the more they throw at it, the more deflation they get, like Japan, right? So that's my mental model of how economies are going to look is more like Japan. I know there are some differences because of the import-export balances in Japan.
Yeah, there is. But demographically, they got there a lot earlier than the other nations. So the spike in that funny, I don't know, she's like a curved woman, but it hit Japan earlier than it's hit the rest of the world.
Yes, interesting observation there, Joe. Thank you very much for that. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, I think we're pretty much there. I'm just going to look back over the chats to see whether I've missed anything critical in terms of question. People are talking about Nelson being very pricey. Don't know about that.
Yeah. I mean, Nelson's a really quite a cool town. I've been out there a couple of times. I think that the impact for them will be, they've got big mix of agriculture and tourism. The thing for them would be how big the impact of reduced tourism is. Now, Nelson, unlike the Coromandel, unlike Taupo, Rotorua, it's actually quite driven by domestic tourism. So I'm hoping they'll hold up. It's a nice spot, and they've had a bit of investment down in the promenade in Hastings and Napier. They've done some good stuff like that. So I'm talking Hawke's Bay. Nelson is where old people go to die. I don't know. We'll see.
Fair enough.
Hawke's Bay.
It's close.
Yeah,
It's close.
I'm not sure about Nelson. There's not enough stock out there at the minute, and it is a very popular place because of the number of hours of sunshine they get. 2,400 hours of sunshine a year, and people do enjoy disappearing there from Christchurch, Wellington, and Auckland when they finish working.
Very good. I'm going to leave you with this thought, Joe. This is from Otto, right? He says, New Zealand is a mini version of Australia. Agricultural economy with naive population hooked on credit-convinced housing always rises, making it self-fulfilling. Think the Ponzi scheme of the 90s Romania.
I'm not sure about Romania, but I think the thing about Australia and New Zealand is that neither government took control of the banking sector after the credit crisis, and lending became more and more relaxed. Government policy became more conducive to tax efficiency. We have an unusual situation where a lot of private landlords are getting their tenants are getting paid subsidies to rent the landlord's house. This is a circular financing motion, and there aren't very many countries that have done that to the extent that New Zealand has. We've removed negative gearing. You haven't. We've got a 5-year bright line test on capital gains, but largely it's negligible. So everything was done that could be done. Government's valuing your house for you at ever increasing numbers to justify how much a bank will lend against it. The two economies are very, very similar in that the governments have run it as population QE and no regulation of the banking sector.
Yep. Well, you could actually say the banking sector has been regulating the country. Oh, should I say that?
Say that with me. No, I totally agree with you. I think the banking sector controlled the narrative on both sides of the ditch.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Well, Joe, I really appreciate your time today. That's been a very entertaining and educational session. I've just got a few people acknowledging that on the chat, so thank you for that. I just want to acknowledge NZ Finance, Sam, Justin, El Porno, interesting little one there, Damien, Aaron, Firewoman NZ, and Nifi for the contributions for the live stream there. Really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Yes. We just hit over 702 tops, which was terrific. Thank you very much. Not quite up to Edwin's standard, but
the RBNZ speech.
Exactly right. Well, maybe they should come on our channel and we'll deliver it through our platform. Maybe it'll get a wider audience. So, Joe, thank you for that. What I'd like to do, let me just do a couple of announcements and I'll come back and just sign off with you. So let me just put the main camera on. So just in terms of what's going to happen next week, I will be on again, same time, same station next week, and we'll be covering the August household stress update. So that will be essentially all the new data that I'm processing at the moment up till the end of August. Bit of a quick turnaround because, of course, 1st of December is on Tuesday, but that will be really important. So we'll get a read as to what's happening with the stress. And the week after that, Tony Lecantro's coming back on. And Tony did a tweet the other day saying he's had the busiest month in his entire life because of what's happened to the stocks. So we'll be able to pick his brains on stocks and also what's happening with some of the other investment classes. So that'll be an interesting one. That's 2 weeks' time. So me next week, Tony the week after. Joe, I just want to say thank you very much for your time tonight. Really have appreciated your insights. Always have fun talking with you. We'll obviously do some more shows ahead. We're going to try and continue to talk about New Zealand and share more information about the New Zealand market because I think there's a really important gap in the marketplace. And I think also we've highlighted again some of the interesting contrasts and also similarities between the new market, the two markets. And I think Otto's point summed it up rather well. So thank you for your time this evening.
I'll try and keep myself away from the swear box as well.
Well, do what you can. But thank you very much.
I appreciate it, guys. Look after yourself, everybody. Have a good evening.
Great, thanks, Joe. And I'm just going to now say thanks to everybody for spending some time this evening. Thanks, Plexus, for doing the moderating so well. Brilliant. And thanks for everybody who's commented and contributed to the debate. I watched some of the other conversations, which I'm not going near because there were some really interesting subjects, but nothing to do with New Zealand and Australia. But that's okay. That's fine. That's all part of what we're doing. So I look forward to seeing you next week. If you've not seen it, there's a very important show on Interests of the People channel relating to gold. And John Adams and I discussed the question of the gold leasing and how that's playing into the gold market in Australia. If you own gold, and particularly if you own synthetic gold products, you must watch that show. There's some really important information there. Anyway, with that, Joe, thanks very much. Wish everybody a good evening, and I'm going to sign off now. We'll see you same time next week. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off.